Tired of fearing you're going to run out of money in retirement? The 4% rule is supposed to help, but most people approach it the wrong way. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you the 3 big mistakes most people make with the 4% rule so you can avoid these mistakes and secure your golden years in retirement. The 3 mistakes that people make are misunderstanding the way required minimum distributions work, viewing annuities in the wrong way, and misunderstanding the way the income and expenses are uneven throughout their retirement years. Let's jump in and I'll show you what I mean. When most people start exploring the impact of RMDs and actually project out what it looks like, they learn that, hey, James, at some point, my required distribution from my IRA is going to exceed 4% per year. Wouldn't that by itself invalidate the 4% rule if I'm going to be required to spend more than 4% per year throughout retirement? We'll even walk through the IRS life expectancy tables that tell you how much you need to take out of your portfolio those first years. For someone that's turning 73 this year, the first year required minimum distribution is just under 3.8% of their pre-tax account value. So that's under 4%, so no big concerns there for most people. But if you look at age 85, for example, the required minimum distribution in a year like that is closer to 6.25%. And so real quickly, people say 6.25% is more than 50% greater than that 4% rule that I'm trying to adhere to. How does that not invalidate everything about the 4% rule? Well, first reason is this. Your required minimum distribution is only on the pre-tax portion of your retirement portfolio. Some people, their pre-tax accounts, so their IRA or 401k is 100% of their portfolio, but for most people, they might have some other money in other places. Let me show you an example of what I mean. This is Roger retired, who's clearly a fictitious person, and Roger's just turned age 73. Now, Roger has his home, but his portfolio value was $1 million, and he's concerned that he might be forced to spend more than 4% per year because of required minimum distributions later on in his retirement. Well, in Roger's case, to keep it simple, I'm going to show that he has half of his money in a pre-tax 401k and half of his money in a Roth IRA. Well, under those assumptions, with 500 grand being in accounts that are subject to required minimum distributions and 500 grand being in accounts that are not subject, here's an actual projection of how much Roger's RMDs will be each year. So this year he turned 73, and his required distribution on a $500,000 account value is $18,868. So like I said, that's just under 3.8% of his pre-tax account value. Now, as this increases, these numbers do start to increase above 4% of the pre-tax account, but that's not what we're looking at. What I'm more concerned with is what's your overall portfolio withdrawal rate. If we look at that, that's really more telling of what we actually care about. Because let's say in Roger's case, he does turn age 85. And at age 85, this number right here represents about 6.25% of his 401k balance. Well, assuming his Roth IRA was the same dollar value as his 401k, a 6.25% withdrawal rate from his pre-tax account represents a withdrawal rate from his overall portfolio of about 3.13%. So reason number 1 that required distributions will not impact the 4% rule and the implementation of it is that's only on the pre-tax account balances that you have. If you have other accounts, what we're really more concerned about is the overall withdrawal of your portfolio as a whole, the overall withdrawal rate, I should say, of your overall portfolio. The second reason required distributions do not invalidate the 4% rule is you can always reinvest any forced withdrawals that you have to make. Let's assume Roger did have the entirety of his $1 million portfolio in his 401k. And he's now in the position where he's being forced to distribute 6%, 7%, 8% per year. Well, the withdrawal isn't such a big deal if he can turn around and reinvest some of it. Sure, he has some tax planning points. Maybe he doesn't want all of his money to be in his pre-tax IRA, but that's a different conversation. If everything was, and he was forced to take 8% out, for example, yes, he'll pay taxes on that. But if he ends up reinvesting 2%, 3%, 4% of that 8% withdrawal, the net withdrawal is decreased. So there's nothing to prevent you from reinvesting that money. You can't reinvest it back into your IRA, but you can always invest it in a brokerage account or something else if you don't have a use for those funds. The third reason that required distributions will not impact or invalidate the 4% rule is the 4% rule is based upon a 30-year life expectancy. In other words, we have to go back to the premise of the 4% rule. The premise or the reason it was done is to say, look, if someone has 30 years ahead of them, what's the most money they can draw from their portfolio and be reasonably assured that they're not going to run out of money? Well, if you're 65, you want to be reasonably sure that you maybe have at least 30 years of expenses or income that can be drawn from a portfolio. If you're 85, you probably don't have 30 years left of life. The shorter your remaining life expectancy, the more you could afford to take out of your portfolio. For example, if I was 90 years old and I knew for certain I was only going to live until 91, why would I limit myself to a 4% withdrawal rate on my portfolio? Of course, I don't know that I only have 1 year left to live, but theoretically, I could spend 100% of my portfolio and not outlive my money. In that case, I'd perfectly live through my money. So the longer you live, the older you are, the less you need to be concerned about maintaining that 4% standard and can actually start to draw more. So all these examples go back to the point that the 4% rule is not invalidated by the impact of required minimum distributions on your account. The second mistake people make when it comes to the implementation of the 4% rule is they wrongly believe that annuities are superior because the initial premium or withdrawal they can take from any money they put into annuities is greater than 4% of the initial premium value. Let me show you what I mean by that. You might have an annuity that if you're 65 years old, the annuity company says, look, James, put $1 million into this annuity and we'll pay you 6% of that initial premium for the rest of your life. Well, you look at that and you say, that's pretty darn attractive. If I have $1 million, I could either invest using the 4% rule, maybe expect to take out $40,000 that first year, or you could go get an annuity that's paying me $60,000 per year for the rest of my life. That looks very attractive. And many people think, well, isn't that superior to the 4% rule? Annuities can be great and annuities can have their place in a plan, but if you're looking at it from that standpoint, you're looking at it in the wrong way. And here's what I mean by that. The annuity, in most cases, a fixed annuity, you're not getting an interest rate adjustment. You're not getting a cost of living adjustment. Now, there are annuities that will provide that, but you're not going to get the same starting premium amount. You're not going to get the same starting income amount if you're also getting an inflation adjustment on your annuity. Most annuities, most fixed annuities are going to be like this, where you get $60,000 this year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year, all while inflation is going up and up and up. And what's happening is your dollar amount that you receive each year is staying the same, but your purchasing power is starting to diminish over time as inflation increases. One of the premises of the 4% rule is it's saying that's a starting withdrawal amount that you can then increase with inflation over the course of your retirement. And so if we simply increase this by a 3% inflation rate over time, what you see is over a 30-year retirement, the actual dollar amount that you'd be taking from this portfolio is greater than the fixed income that you would be receiving from an annuity. Now, obviously, I'm making some assumptions here about what inflation's doing, how the portfolio is performing, but here's actually the biggest assumption, the biggest thing to keep in mind with this. Once you pass away with an annuity, maybe there's a survivor benefit that your spouse gets, but once you and your spouse pass, that's gone. One of the interesting things to note about spending using the 4% rule is that the majority of people who go into retirement and invest their money the right way and take 4% that initial year and just adjust it for inflation, they are significantly more likely to have more money left in their portfolio when they pass away than they did at the beginning of retirement. So not only is your income greater at this point, but you also are very likely to have a fairly significant portfolio balance left that you can use to pass on to heirs or to keep living if you end up living longer than the 30 years that I'm illustrating on this page here. So I'm not here to say that you should never consider an annuity. There's many great planning points that sometimes exist with annuities. What I am saying is if this is the lens that you're looking through, it's not an apples to apples comparison if all you're doing is looking at the initial income that you can create that first year of retirement between an annuity versus that same dollar amount being invested in a standard portfolio that you take 4% from. The third mistake I see people make with the 4% rule is they assume people spend the same amount of money every year in retirement. Here's a comment that one of you left on a video not too long ago, and you really nailed it. And what the comment's showing is 4% rule works on paper. In theory, it works great, and in practice, it works great. What's different is it's not as if most people take one amount from their portfolio that first year of retirement and then simply take that same exact amount every year going forward. Here's another fictitious retiree to illustrate what I mean by this. This is Ruby retired. She's 63, and here's her different investment accounts. Now, Ruby's looking at retiring, and so when we look at this, her goal, she's 63 today, and she wants to retire now. Here's her retirement expenses. Here's healthcare costs, as you can see, and what those look like before Medicare, and then out-of-pocket costs after Medicare. And she wants to travel, spending an extra $10,000 per year for the first 10 years of retirement. So this is the spending that Ruby wants to maintain, and let's take a look at her income sources. Her salary just went away because she retired. Here's her Social Security benefit. Keep in mind, she's 63 today. She wants to take her benefit at age 70, and her benefit will be $3,000 per month at that time. She'll also have a pension of $12,000 per year, $1,000 per month, and that will start at her age 65, so 2 years from today. So with all that information in mind, let's take a look at Ruby's cash flows. So she just retired, and if we take a look at her income flows, see there's no more income from salary. Social Security, there's a bunch of zeros because she doesn't collect that until age 70, and then that kicks in. Her pension, she gets nothing for the next couple of years, and then she receives $12,000 per year from there on forward. That's her income sources, and then here's her expenses. Her normal living expenses plus healthcare, we see these adjusted for inflation, and then travel. Travel is another expense that she doesn't have forever, but we want to budget that in for the first several years of retirement, and then that goes away at age 72. So based upon all this, when we start to compare Ruby's inflows, you see how these are uneven. It's zero in income the first couple years, if we exclude her portfolio. Then there's $12,000 per year in income for the next several years. And then income bumps up to $55,000 or so, adjusted for inflation, for the next several years. Now let's compare that to her expenses. More or less, her expenses are fairly consistent for the first few years. Taxes are a little lower just because of where she's drawn her income from the first couple years, but her living expenses, her healthcare, that's going to stay pretty static the whole time. What's not going to is her travel goal. She has these expenses that we can plan for the next 10 years, but she doesn't think she'll be traveling too much after that. So her expenses are increasing with inflation, but then what happens is they drop off right here. So what does that mean? What are the implications of that? It means she's going to need different amounts from her portfolio at different times. She's going to need more upfront because there's no pension in those first couple years. Well, then the amount she takes out of her portfolio actually decreases because now the pension kicks in, less of a need from her portfolio. As Social Security kicks in the future, you can see her portfolio needs drop from almost $80,000 to about $36,000 per year. Then even after that, here's her portfolio need. Once Social Security kicks in, that drops again once she stops spending money on travel, once she's not traveling quite as much. So as we look at this, even though Ruby's lifestyle remained fairly consistent, same expenses going forward, except for she stops traveling so much later on. It's kind of the go-go years at the beginning. We have the slow-go years in the middle and the no-go years at the end. Well, if we look at this, if we look at the withdrawal rate, even though Ruby's lifestyle stayed fairly consistent with the exception of travel, her withdrawal rate was anything but. She spent way more of her portfolio those first several years. What's the reason for that? Well, pension doesn't kick in for a couple years. Social Security doesn't kick in for 7 years. Way more pressure on her portfolio those first several years, but once Social Security and pension do fully kick in, you can see that her withdrawal rate drops pretty significantly. Once she stops traveling in these years here, it drops even more. Bumps up again when required distributions start, but what we can see here is because most people's plan, they don't have the same exact income sources all the way throughout retirement. They don't have the same exact expenses all the way throughout retirement. So 4% rule, or anything like it, is a very helpful guideline. It's a very helpful benchmark to have a clear understanding of what can a portfolio support. But keep in mind, it's probably not going to be the exact same withdrawal rate you take every year throughout retirement, simply due to the fact that in reality, income and expenses are going to vary from year to year. So those are 3 things that people typically get wrong with the 4% rule. And like I said, the 4% rule can be really helpful as a starting point for what can this portfolio support in terms of income throughout retirement. But you need to be realistic and understand what real life actually looks like for most retirees. And I want to go back to that last point I make about income and expenses not being consistent. That's probably the most challenging thing for most people to plan through in retirement. The question is, if we don't have a portfolio that needs to support a consistent amount of income, how do we allocate that portfolio? Knowing there's some years we need to take out a lot more, some years we need to take out a lot less. Well, I made this video right here. And in this video, I walk you through what should you be doing with your portfolio once you know what those income and those withdrawal rates are going to look like to make sure that your portfolio is properly aligned to your income sources. So I hope you'll take a look because I think that's going to be very helpful as you determine what the portfolio needs to do to account for changing income and changing expenses. Once again, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial, and if you're interested in seeing how we help our clients at Root Financial get the most out of life with their money, be sure to visit us at www.rootfinancialpartners.com.